The following lecture is called God and Evil. It's by H.J. McCloskey, a contemporary philosopher. And what it is a critique of religious explanations to try to explain why evil and God can be thought of as possibly coexisting. In other words, let me just show you this word, or words. There's theodicy, theodicist, anti-theodicist. Theodicy, Theodicy, theodicist, and anti-theodicist. The theodicist is a religious explanation of evil to try to show how it can be reasonable, or at least not unreasonable, to believe in God and also to acknowledge the existence of evil. Okay, now, H.J. McCloskey is what you might call an anti-theodicist. That is to say, he's going to be a person who's going to look at the major arguments to try to explain evil from a religious point of view and try to poke holes in those arguments. So he's an anti-theodicist. The essay that follows this, called The Problem of Evil by God.Hick, is an essay written by a theodicist. That is a person who is going to try to explain how it is reasonable, or again, at least not unreasonable, to believe both in God and in evil. Okay, so McCloskey is a secular philosopher, and he's a person who does not believe there is a perfect God. Now, what's interesting, he doesn't discuss the possibility of there being an imperfect God, imperfect in power or goodness. At least he doesn't spend much at all space discussing such a possibility, because he thinks that most people who believe in God believe that God is unlimited in power and goodness, and that God on some level is perfect. But what he says is, he goes, let's look at the problem of evil as he sees it. And we're talking about the problem of evil within the context of what might be called ethical monotheism. Ethical monotheism. And if you want to know, ethical monotheism is a belief in a personal God, a belief in a God who takes an interest in the creation. And the ethical monotheism is associated with, for example, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so when he talks about the problem of evil, he's talking about the problem of evil within the context of ethical monotheism. And he says that if you think about God as perfect, then the question becomes, well, why is there evil? And because evil normally would be considered an imperfection, how do you get imperfection from perfection? In other words, then the idea is, well, if God is all powerful, why isn't God getting rid of evil? And if God is all good, why wouldn't God want to get rid of evil? So if God is considered both all good and all powerful, why isn't God both willing and able to get rid of evil? Why is there evil? And so then the existence of evil is supposed to call into question the existence of a perfect God, a God unlimited in various ways, including in respect of goodness and power. And then McCloskey quotes from a Catholic philosopher, a Jesuit, who says the existence of evil in the world must at all times be the greatest of all problems which the mind encounters when it reflects on God and his relation to the world. If he is indeed all good and all powerful, how has evil any place in the world which he has made? Whence came it? Why is it here? If he's all good, why do he allow it to arise? If all powerful, why does he not deliver us from the burden? Alike in the physical and moral creation seems so grievously marred that we find it hard to understand how it can derive its entirety from God. Okay, Now, remember, the guy writing this is a religious believer, okay? But he's saying, well, I'm a believer, and I believe in God, but I must acknowledge that the existence of evil can be a stumbling block for many people who wonder why there's so much evil, why there's so much suffering, and if God is perfect. Okay? So then McCloskey goes on to distinguish the two main forms of evil. Moral evil, that is the evil that people do, that is a product of their actions, and natural or physical evil, the evil that is a result of the workings of nature, as when there's destruction and harm and suffering caused by tsunamis, caused by diseases, caused by the cold, caused by destructive parasites, caused by the suffering of animals, non-human animals even. For example, carnivorous animals in the wild can be fed only to the extent that they create suffering for other animals. But anyway, so those are, I mean, sometimes people say, isn't there also aesthetic evil, which would be ugliness? But the two main classes of evil normally are moral evil, that is, evil that's a product of people's actions, and many people would say the product of their choices. And then there's a physical/natural evil. And then both are pretty serious, and there are different sorts of arguments to explain these evils from a religious standpoint. And here's, again, McCloskey quotes from the Jesuit thinker, his name is Joyce, Joyce. The actual amount of suffering which the human race endures is immense. And then he goes, disease has store in it and to spare of torments for the body, and disease and death are the lot to which you must all look forward. At all times, too, great numbers of the race are pinched by want, nor is the world ever free for very long from the terrible sufferings which follow in the track of war. If we concentrate our attention on human woes to the exclusion of the joys of life, we gain an appalling picture of the ills to which the flesh is heir. So too, if we fasten our attention on the sterner side of nature, on the pains which men endure from natural forces, on the storms which wreck their ships, the cold which freezes them to death, the fire which consumes them, if we contemplate this aspect of nature alone, we may be led to wonder how God came to deal so harshly with his creatures as to provide them with such a home. Okay, so you can understand. Now remember, this person's religious. This person definitely believes in God. But he says, well, it's staggering how much suffering there is in the world. And he can understand why this could make some people doubt the goodness or power or even the existence of God. But in any event, so then what happens is McCloskey ends up talking about moral evil. He says physical evils create one of the groups of problems referred to by the theist as the problem of evil. Moral evil creates quite a distinct problem. Moral evil is simply immorality. Evils such as selfishness, envy, greed, deceit, cruelty, callousness, cowardice, and the larger scale evils such as wars and the atrocities they involve. Moral evil is commonly regarded as constituting an even more serious problem than physical evil. So what does Joyce, this Catholic, say? The man who sins thereby offends God. We are called on to explain how God came to create an order of things in which rebellion and even final rejection have such a place. Since a choice from among an infinite number of possible worlds lay open to God, how came he to choose one in which these occur? Is not such a choice in flagrant opposition to the divine goodness? Now remember, McCloskey is not a religious skeptic. McCloskey definitely believes in God, and yet he is moved by the suffering in the world, the amount of evil in the world, and he understands how such suffering and evil can lead people to doubt the existence of God. And then, so he goes on, that is, McCloskey goes on and quotes from literature, Dostoevsky, and about the evil that people produce and suffer. And then he goes on, and then he discusses proposed solutions to the problem of evil. Okay. So, now, one solution is that physical good is impossible without physical evil. Now, McCloskey says that, strictly speaking, if we analyze the world, we can see that that's not strictly speaking true. He says, why does it have to be true that at least theoretically we couldn't have good health without bad health? Why couldn't we theoretically have good smells and good taste without bad smells and bad taste? Why couldn't we theoretically have sanity without insanity? Now think for a moment. Now, many, if not most, if not all of you know something about the book of Genesis in the Bible. And in the book of Genesis, when it talks about Adam and Eve, it says that they were living in the Garden of Eden, which was supposed to be a paradise, right? Presumably there wasn't any suffering, right? There wasn't any physical want. There wasn't any starvation. There wasn't any disease. Presumably the animals got along with one another, but before the fall of man and woman. But anyway, so some people would say, if it's conceivable, if we can imagine some state of affairs, then if God is all-powerful, God can create it. And so what McCloskey is saying is this. He's saying, why does it have to be true that if you have, let's say, good health, that you have to have some disease? Why does it have to be true if you have good smells, you have to have bad smells? Why couldn't you have neutral smells? Why does it have to be true that if you have good taste, you have to have bad taste? Why couldn't you have good taste and neutral taste? In any event, so he thinks, strictly speaking, it isn't true that whatever is physically good, there has to be some sort of corresponding evil. Furthermore, he says, even if it were true that we needed evil, physical evil, to recognize and certainly to appreciate physical good, because why do we need to have so much physical evil and so much suffering? Why could, to have a contrast, you don't need to have a huge amount of the negative, or again, if you think of like whether it's blue or yellow, he goes, well, why, if you have, whether it's blue or yellow, you could have blue, even if it were true, in order to recognize blue, you need to have a yellow, let's say. Even if that were true, why would you have to have an immense amount of one of these things? And especially, what does it matter whether it's yellow or blue? But the point is, he denies that it's just true, that it's always the case that whenever you have something physically good, such as pleasure, physical pleasure, you have to have physical evil. And he certainly denies that even if that were true, that you would have to have as much physical evil as we have. One of his ideas is that he thinks there's so much evil in the world and there's so much suffering that it's unlikely that every bit of it is essential to some higher justifying purpose. So he does have this idea of superfluous or unnecessary evil, and that's how he's going to end his essay. He's going to think there's so much evil that it is unlikely that every bit of it is essential to some higher justifying purpose. Now, another explanation for physical evil is that physical evil is God's punishment for sin. McCloskey says if you look around the world, you'll see babies suffering. Babies can be born with various physical maladies, various diseases. Babies can be born and suffer, and that's true of young children. And yet, he says one would be hard-pressed to look at what they've done in their short lives and say they must have done something to warrant the kind of suffering they're undergoing. So, according to McCloskey, there's no sort of neat correlation between the amount of suffering, physical suffering someone endures, and the amount of evil they create. And often, there seems to be an obvious imbalance as when babies or young children suffer. Okay, so he thinks that that a lot of physical evil, a lot of pain, doesn't seem to be neatly correlated with the any kind of evil that someone is creating. Now, someone could use an argument and say that some, but not all, the physical evil is punishment for sin. But he thinks that a lot of it is not, and a lot of suffering will fall on innocent human beings. There's another explanation for physical evil, and it's God's warning to people, right? Whether it's the flood, Noah's flood, right? The great flood. Some people say, well, God, in the Hebrew scriptures, or what people call the Old Testament, there are a lot of cases where God would destroy a whole city, whether it was with a plague, and then more than a whole city with a great flood, or there are other things that God would use, whether in destroy people's crops or whatever, using natural means such as locusts and so on. But the question is, why does physical evil occur? And some people say, well, it's a way in which God can warn people. He's saying, look, you got to change your behavior. If not, you're going to end up getting diseases. You're going to end up getting, you're going to have locusts destroying your crops. Now, here's what McCloskey says. McCloskey says, first of all, if God is all powerful and all good, why can't God use good or non-evil means to warn people? Now, you can imagine how that may work. Certainly, you could imagine that, I suppose, that someone is out to kill his wife so they can inherit money. He's got life insurance, and he's not getting along with his wife, and he has a lover on the side, let's say. Things like that obviously happen. But you can imagine, and he doesn't give us an example, but as he's walking on the street to go home to poison his wife or some other way kill his wife, so he can collect the insurance money and then marry someone else. You can imagine that there would be some neon traffic sign or something at a crosswalk, and it says, George, you better not kill your wife or you'll be sorry, God. Or you could imagine, let's say, that George has some really serious physical problem, and he has what some people call out-of-body experiences. And then he has an overwhelming sense of love as he's going through this tunnel, and then he has a totally different view of how he should respond, and of God, and his moral obligations. So in other words, I think the idea, according to McCloskey, is that if God is all good and all powerful, God should not choose a way to warn people, to get them to change their behavior and become better people, that is itself evil. And because according to McCloskey, excuse me, let me cut off my speaker. I thought it was off. According to McCloskey, McCloskey says physical evil is causing a lot of people to be alienated from God and to lose faith in God, and it's causing separation from God. And so, if you think about it, why are some people agnostic? A lot of them are agnostic and saying they don't have a definite belief in God. They don't certainly are not atheists saying God doesn't exist, but a lot of their being unreligious is their response to the immense amount of suffering in the world. And so the other point is that if you think of, it is true that sometimes suffering can bring people closer to God and religion. That's true. But it's also true that a parent whose child suffers a great deal because of some disease and who dies can alienate parents from God. And so McCloskey's view is, if God is all powerful and all good, why can't God find non-evil means to warn people and inspire people and to get people to act better and more lovingly and more righteously? Another explanation for physical evil is that evil is simply a result of the operations of the laws of nature. In other words, that there are physical regularities that we need in order to function, right? We need to have gravity normally on Earth, right? And we need to have certain predictable occurrences for us to be able to function. We need to be able to whatever it is. I mean, if you want to, we need to know what sort of actions can we take so that we can be fitter and healthier. What sort of actions can we take so that we can build things and create a food supply? So we need to have these regularities, dependable regularities. And so we need nature. And we need to have a nature that is not completely chaotic, but very largely predictable. And that's how we can function successfully. Now, what happens, of course, is that because of the way things are, people can accidentally fall off tall buildings. Sometimes they can be pushed off tall buildings. Sometimes they can jump. But sometimes they can fall off. And they can fall and be seriously injured or be killed. Our bodies, we have these endoskeletons, and we're not, excuse me, we're not like roaches with exoskeletons. Roaches can withstand a lot of trauma to their bodies, more than people. But at least the way the world is, and the way people are, and the way tall buildings are, people can fall, and they can be seriously injured or killed. And so I think his view is, why didn't God either create a different set of laws, more hospitable and beneficial to the human beings, or why doesn't God intervene more often to neutralize the ill effects of the laws that God has created? I mean, for example, physical illness, typically, or I shouldn't say typically, but some physical illnesses are highly contagious, right? Think of the flu, the novel coronavirus, and so on. Or tuberculosis. Anyway, some physical illnesses are highly contagious, and normally, so ill health can be catching in a way that good health normally isn't catching, right? Or think of all the people who have died because they ingested poisonous plants. How did they learn about? They learned about poisonous plants by eating them, and we're talking about huge numbers of people who have died. Now, so I think not Hick, but that's the guy with the next lecture. But McCloskey is going to say, well, why didn't God create us in such a way that we could eat what are now poisonous plants, or why didn't God warn us against eating poisonous plants and how to identify them? Or why doesn't God identify them so that people know that those plants are poisonous so they wouldn't eat them? So again, I think his view is that if God is all powerful and all good, and God is responsible for the natural laws, why didn't God create laws more hospitable to human beings? Or why didn't God create us to be able to handle what are currently the bad effects of the current laws? Or why doesn't God intervene more often to neutralize the ill effects of the laws? Okay, now there's another explanation for physical evil, and that is the universe is better with evil in it. And there are there are different versions of it. Here's one version. It's quoted by McCloskey. He's quoting again Joyce, the Roman Catholic who's a Jesuit priest. Just as the human artist has in view the beauty of his composition as a whole, not making it his aim to give to each several part of the highest degree of brilliancy, but that measure of adornment which most contributes to the combined effect, so it is with God. Another version of this general type of argument explains evil. This is McCloskey. Not so much as the component of a good whole, seen out of its context as a mere component, but rather as a means to a greater good. Different as these versions are, they are to be treated here as one general type of argument, for the same criticisms are fatal to both versions. This kind of argument, if valid, simply shows that some evil may enrich the universe. It tells us nothing about how much evil will enrich this particular universe, and how much will be too much. So even if valid, and he doesn't think it is, such an argument does not in itself provide a justification for the evil in the universe. It shows simply that the evil which occurs might have a justification. In view of the immense amount of evil, the probabilities are against it. This is the main point made by Wisdom. He's talking about a philosopher, John Wisdom, in his discussion of this argument. Wisdom sums up his criticism as follows: "It remains to add that unless there are independent arguments in favor of this world as being the best logically possible world, it is probable that some of the evils in it are not logically necessary for a compensating good. It is probable because there are so many evils." Wisdom's reply brings out that the person who relies upon this argument as a conclusive and complete argument is seriously mistaken. The argument, if valid, justifies only some evil. A belief that it justifies all the evil that occurs in the world is mistaken, for a second argument by way of a supplement to it is needed. The supplementary argument would take the form of a proof that all the evil that occurs is in fact valuable and necessary as a means to greater good. Such a supplementary proof is in principle impossible, so at best this fifth argument can be taken to show only that some evil may be necessary for the production of good, and that the evil in the world may perhaps have a justification on this account. This is not to justify a physical evil, but simply to suggest that physical evil might nonetheless have a justification, although we may never come to know this justification. He goes, thus the argument, even if it is valid, its general form of reasoning is unsatisfactory because inconclusive. It is, however, also unsatisfactory in that it follows on the principle of the argument that just as it's possible that evil in the total context contributes to increasing the total ultimate good, so equally it will hold that good in the total context may increase the ultimate evil. Thus, if the principle of the argument were sound, we could never know whether evil is really evil or good really good. By implication, it follows that it would be dangerous to eliminate evil because we may thereby introduce a discordant element into the divine symphony of the universe, and conversely it may be wrong to condemn the elimination of what is good because the latter may result in the production of more higher goods. So it follows that even if the general principle of the argument is not questioned, it is still seen to be a defective argument. On the one hand, it proves too little. It justifies only some evil, not necessarily all the evil in the universe. On the other hand, it proves too much because it creates doubts about the goodness of apparent goods. These criticisms in themselves are fatal to the argument as a solution to the problem of evil. Okay, now he also looks at various arguments for explaining moral evil. Now remember, moral evil is the evil that people do. Now, the arguments usually revolve around the value of free will. Now, what he says, though, is, yes, it's true that free will seems to have explanatory power when it comes to moral evil. I mean, so often people say, look, isn't it better that we have both good and evil, and we have the choice to do good or evil, even if that results in evil? Isn't it better that we're not robots, that we're not automata, that in fact we have free will, and that isn't that a great thing, that we can also be creators to some degree of our futures through our choices, and that we can also learn from our mistakes? Now, what he says is, however valuable free will is, McCloskey says it doesn't have unlimited value, because why is that? Well, he says, look at it this way: suppose free will led to our having a lot more suffering than we do today. Suppose free will led to people like Hitler being the norm, and so you would just have people constantly being tortured, murdered, and enslaved. He says, would we think that it would be better to have free will in that universe than to have no free will and yet have not have that level of suffering? He says, furthermore, we don't value free will unlimitedly because and unqualifiedly, because don't we, when people are dangerous and commit crimes, put them in prison? Aren't we limiting their freedom? Right? Aren't we? So therefore, he says, we don't value free will unqualifiedly. It's a good, but that's not a good of infinite value. And it's quite possible that the level of free will we have is creating so much suffering that maybe we'd be better off if we had less free will, or maybe even no free will. But in any event, Now, so he says, okay, well then someone may try to defend free will, not by saying that free will alone will justify the amount of moral evil that we have, but that free will is valuable not only in itself, but also as a means to producing other things that are good. What are some of these other things? Well, how about when people behave properly? There's the cat, my cat. When they behave properly and they improve themselves, how about if they go to heaven? How about if people are redeemed and renounce the life of sin and become better people? How about that's a great victory. And so you can imagine, when you think about the supreme happiness of people in heaven, when you think about the victory over sin, when you think about people who learn from evil and then they become better persons, all these things are very, very positive. Okay, so you could say, well, free will is valuable, but guess what? It's also it's valuable in itself. It's better, other things being equal, to be a human being with free will than some being without free will. But in addition to that, free will is valuable because of the good things that it opens up. Victory over sin, eternity in heaven, okay, redemption, salvation, anyway, all these things. And so according to McCloskey's, someone may think, well, in fact, free will is worth the cost of its misuse. But then he says, well, we still have an enormous amount of suffering in the world, even if we do have free will, and even if it's valuable. Furthermore, he says that if you also throw in the possibility of hell into the mix, and if you also believe that many, many souls, possibly more, a majority, but anyway, many, many souls will suffer in hell, and for some of them possibly endlessly, he says he doesn't see how you can say so clearly that we're better off having free will and the current system than if we had less free will or no free will. Now that's interesting. I mean, I suppose the idea is that you could also think of maybe if God made people more loving, more naturally loving, more intelligent, more able to see long-term consequences, that maybe there would be less suffering than there is today. Okay, and so this is interesting. You know, if you could bring in hell, and if you include the idea of within hell the idea of endless suffering, then McCloskey says, well, it's not at all obvious that even if a number of people go to heaven, that having all those people in hell is the ideal situation. You know, we're going to talk more about this next time, because there's some people who will argue, including religious people, that there are three fundamentally different ways in which God can finally deal with evil. One is that God could conceivably just annihilate evil. I suppose there are many people, including Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe that maybe 144,000 people will ultimately be saved, but everyone else will simply be annihilated. They're not going to be preserved in torment, but they'll just be annihilated. Another way to deal with evil would be to redeem people. That is to say, to have people become better and more righteous, to have them their hearts in a way improved, if you like, and then they could have salvation. Now, I think a lot of people, probably most people, would say that would be ideal, right? And then the third way of dealing with evil, you could, well, at least the third way I can easily think of, would be to preserve the people in their fallen state. In other words, you could have some or all the evil souls just being separated from God and separated from any of God's mercy, separated from salvation, and then stewing, so to speak, in their own juices. Well, the next philosopher we look at, God.Hick, who's a religious believer, thinks that would be a very bad solution, and he thinks that God wants what was best for God's children, and so God wouldn't do that. But for someone like McCloskey, he would say, well, look, aren't there a lot of religious people who believe in endless suffering for a certain number of souls? And so McCloskey thinks if you look at all the suffering that we know about in this current world, and then you add to it the suffering of the next world, to the extent that people believe in an endless hell, he thinks that it's very difficult to see how all of it would be compatible with some higher justifying purpose. In any event, McCloskey doesn't think that appealing to free will, and whatever good free will can come from free will, including the salvation of a certain number of people or souls, he doesn't think that that is it's a slam dunk, that to say that, well, if we have that, then that justifies all the suffering that people may undergo, including the possibility of suffering endlessly in an afterlife, according to some views of hell. In any event, McCloskey thinks there is so much evil, both the physical evil and the moral evil, that it is unlikely that all the evil is essential, again, to some higher justifying purpose. And that's why he has this idea of superfluous evil, unnecessary evil, evil that is goes beyond what can reasonably be thought necessary to be justified by some higher purpose. Given the amount of evil in the world, McCloskey thinks it's unlikely that the world was created by and is governed by and overseen by a perfect creator. And again, he doesn't look at the possibility that there is a creator, but the creator is less than perfect, limited in power and goodness. He's just concerned with the traditional view of God as unlimited in power and goodness. And he thinks that he's evaluated the major religious arguments for trying to show how you can have God and evil. And he thinks that, in fact, all of them are lacking. And so, therefore, he thinks it's unlikely that, given the amount of evil in the world, that all of it is essential to some higher justifying purpose, and therefore he thinks it's unlikely that a perfect creator exists. Now, the next essay is by God.Hick, who is a believer, who thinks it is possible to create a reasonable and plausible theodicy, religious explanation of evil, and that's what we're going to go over next time. But I pretty much covered what I wanted to cover with McCloskey's anti-theodicy. Okay, in other words, his attempt to try to poke holes in the traditional explanations of evil from a religious point of view.